All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a lovely Friday afternoon, and thank you all of you for showing up. It's almost the end of the week already, and we really appreciate everybody turning up today for this City in Nature webinar, the first of the series that we have. And for all of you who recall, there used to be Urban Sustainability R&D Congress that was held uh, almost every other year. And because of the current situation, we have turned it into the MND Urban Sustainability R&D e-Symposia series. And uh, symposiums and webinars will be held by different agencies, and MParks will be hosting a series of City in Nature webinars. And this is one of the first sessions. This is, in fact, the first session. So we are very, very happy to have you all here today. And the theme for today essentially revolves around technology, innovation, and how we can use technology, innovation, science, research to advance our vision of city in nature. And everybody who is here, everybody knows that Singapore is going towards a particular vision, and that vision has been planted ever since 1963, right, when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew planted the first Mempat at Holland Circle. And this is a very nice story. We have stayed stable all throughout all these years. The vision has not wavered, and it has taken several iterations along the way. And last year, what we had was, of course, a transition into city in nature. And city in nature is a very compelling vision. It is us as a first world city living harmoniously within an urban ecosystem. It is unlike anything else in the world, and it's of course driven by the fact that as a country with only 710 square kilometers approximately, there are a lot of constraints into trying to squeeze a first world country into a very nice, lush, green living environment that will be built for the people and will also reap the benefits of ecosystem services, right? And it's really something very ambitious, and we are learning that a lot of things constrain us. And one of the ways that we can move forward and break out of these constraints is to apply technology, is to apply science. And we really are top of the world when we are talking about applying science into solving all these problems that we face, all the challenges that place themselves in the way of having a very nice, thriving city in nature where human beings can live harmoniously, enjoy the benefits of ecosystem services, live in harmony with all the denizens of the green nation, such as your flora and fauna. So today we have a very exciting lineup of speakers for you. There are some people who are very well known, and everybody who is speaking today in this webinar are the masters of their game. They are actually experts in their own right. So we have a very nice lineup, four speakers today, and I shall start off with our first speaker, and he's Dr. Adrian Lu. Adrian Lu is the of um, group director of the Wildlife Management Division in MParks, and he will give you an overview of various remote sensing methods used in Singapore for tracking and detecting biodiversity. So he'll start off by thanking you and launch into his live presentation on the spot. Yes, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adrian, and I'm from National Parks. And today, the title of my talk is Remote Sensing for Biodiversity Detection and Tracking. Basically, talks about the use of things like camera traps, acoustic systems, radio tracking, satellite tracking, and LiDAR to detect biodiversity and to use these sensors for tracking biodiversity. Actually, part of that story about um, tracking biodiversity is also tied to our city nature vision. So we evolved from garden city to city in a garden, and that's thanks to more than 50 years of greening, intensifying our tree planting, strengthening our connectivity of parks and greenery with our park connector network, and integrating greenery with the built environment. But now we have reached a new paradigm, and that's thanks to climate change and the fact that we know that climate change is real. And how do we combat it? That city in the nature vision actually serves to combat climate change through nature-based solutions um, in achieving climate resilience, ecological resilience, and social resilience. And how do we do that? Our key strategies in becoming a city in nature is number one, extending our natural park network, intensifying nature in our gardens and parks, restoring nature into the urban landscape, and strengthening connectivity between our green spaces. If you look at all the words there, you can see that nature plays a very big part. But how do we monitor that nature or the ecosystem is healthy? That's why these sensors are very important. These biodiversity sensors are very important. Remote sensing allow us to do a lot of this without having to go into the field so often, or really um, allowing us to have a bigger coverage in sensing nature, sensing our biodiversity remotely as well, and getting more data to understand how our biodiversity is doing in Singapore. So our sensors actually support our species recovery program, conservation, as well as wildlife management. Just a few species here that are very interesting. We have the hairless rambutan here on the left, and it's actually food to that Raffles banded langur you see on the top right corner, a very rare species. In the past, this langur was only numbering about maybe five. That's about maybe 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and everybody thought it would go extinct. Today, thanks to the conservation of our nature parks and strengthening our habitats through habitat enhancement by planting trees that are food sources for these animals. We've seen that population grow to 50 to 60, and that not only applies to the Raffles banded langur, but in the middle here you see the straw-headed bulbul, and through its range, which is Southeast Asia, it has its stronghold in Singapore. And Pulau Ubin is one of the places where you can actually hear this very melodious bird. So you take a trip there, you go in the morning, and you just hear this bird going, singing this very beautiful song. So um, our sensors not only, are used to conserve species, but they're also used to manage some of these species to prevent human-wildlife conflict. And at the bottom of the right-hand corner here, you see a crocodile. We also use sensors to detect where they move, how they move, and understand these more and understand species like the macaques as well, and some of the pest birds that we have. So I'll be talking about camera traps and night vision equipment that really help us greatly and we employ a lot. It's like almost our staple for our surveys. And then I'll be talking about GPS telemetry. This technology has come to a point where it's so advanced that you can remotely just watch an animal, move really from the desktop. I'll be showcasing a satellite tracking project of migratory shorebirds. Singapore sits in a very interesting place in the globe, and that's where the migratory birds actually fly during the winter season. They overwinter in Singapore, fly all the way to Australia from as far as the Arctic, and then when when winter is over, actually fly up to the northern hemisphere. I'll be talking about other sensors that we use as well, and also some of the sensors that we use for tree management. So these biodiversity sensors not only apply to animals but plants as well. So I'll go into camera traps and night vision equipment. You can see here one of my colleagues. She's placing a camera trap in the forest, and then once she has placed that, what happens is that this camera trap can detect animals just by an infrared sensor that is triggered when the animal moves. And it not only captures pictures, but also captures video as well. So one of the very important tools that we use is a night vision equipment. This is very important because it detects the animal via thermal sensing. It's non-intrusive, meaning that when we go and observe nocturnal animals, most of the mammals we have are nocturnal, and that's at night. And in the past, you would have to use a very strong torchlight, and this really disrupted their behavior as well because they would just be frozen and then you just see them. But if you use a night vision camera, what you see is natural movement is unimpeded. It's not afraid of you because it doesn't really detect you. You don't use strong torchlights. And it's very good for documenting that natural behavior, and then you can play back for analysis. Yeah. So, and even when that animal is masked by dense vegetation, you can actually spot it because you know that whole image, as you can see there, you know, it's a very bright white image that comes out. You can actually really observe the animal without really interfering with their behavior. This has helped us in our Sunda slow loris species recovery program. We understand what it eats, what kind of trees it actually likes to climb on, such so that it allows us, you know, when we try to improve the habitat, we understand which trees that it likes and what kind of tree architecture it likes as well. This also allows us to document other nocturnal animals like your colugos, your civets, and your flying squirrels. So below here is actually a slow loris. It's rather fat. It's very cute, and we documented this in our Central Catchment Nature Reserve. And we got to know these animals very well through the night vision equipment that we knew where they actually like to be. So we encountered this fellow quite often. Um, as an example, you can see this palm civet, common palm civet. They are like the gardeners of the forest, and it's eating durian flowers. So in effect, it's actually pollinating the durian flowers. We thought that it was only bats that do this, but we're quite surprised to see a palm civet actually eating the durian flowers. In doing so, it actually passes the pollen to another flower when it moves from one flower to another. So that was a very interesting observation. And also this Malayan colugo, some of you might have seen it in the forest in the day sleeping, but this is when it's active. So at night when nocturnal animals are active, the night vision goggles actually help a lot. So these are nocturnal birds, the owl, the nightjar, the pinstripe babbler also. Um, my personal experience is that you are able to see the animal in that whole background of darkness when you use the night vision goggles. So it's easier to spot things as well when you use the night vision goggles. Um, yeah, and this was I was here looking at the samba deer as well. This is a harem of samba deer, female samba deer. So they have mating seasons where the female actually in a way stalks a male, and that's how you observe them. In the past, without the night vision goggles, when we go near them and shine the torchlight at them, they will actually just run away. They're very skittish. And on the right, you can see how the night vision goggles allow us to actually look at some of these bad news as well. Yeah. This is a very nice footage of the Sunda pangolin that was released into the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. So the night vision goggles allows us to watch it without frightening it because this was captive raised, it was injured and then managed to we worked with the zoo to rehabilitate it and then release it. So we are able to release it at night when you know it's active. So and observe it without impeding it as well. So these are camera traps that we use. It looks like that. It's like a nice box. It's become very inexpensive. You can buy one for less than $100. So we employ this throughout our nature reserves. And by doing that, right, instead of camping out in the nature reserves to watch this, and for days and nights to watch animals, you can actually put this on a tree where we think that an animal might walk past, and then switch it on, and it's only triggered when an animal walks past. So you can actually leave it there for about 2 months, and then after go back there and then collect like 2 months worth of data. So we've been able to do that with these camera traps. Um, and this is one application. This is the Raffles Bender Langer. We actually built a road bridge across the old Upper Thompson Road, and we were wondering whether this Raffles Bender Langer will use this. So we put our CCTV and camera traps there, and lo and behold, it's a very curious animal, and it was actually wiping the screen of the camera trap. Um, we wanted to, the road bridge was built for a reason. That's to actually facilitate the movement of the Langer across the Central Catchment Nature Reserve to Thompson Nature Park. And why is this important? Because it, without that link, it might use the road, and sometimes we have to prune some of these trees for safety. So it's sort of so to augment the tree canopy, and whenever we prune also, we might lose some of that link. So by having that road bridge, right, it allows this Raffles Bender Langer to cross safely through the road. Another way of another structure that really promotes connectivity is the Ecolink. And here you have the slow lorries, moving um, on the Ecolink. So we also study whether animals are using the Ecolink, and here it is. Um, Animals like that, right, when they move through the Ecolink from one forest fragment to another, it's very important. Firstly, they they actually function to disperse fruits when they move across, and this allows for some of the rare fruits from, let's say, Bukit Timah to move over to the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, thereby, from one population of a rare species, you have two now, one in Bukit Timah, one in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. So in case anything to happens to one population, another population is there as a guarantee. So this is in fact a very simple example of ecological resilience. Yeah, yeah. So these are some footages of animals that we've trapped with our camera traps. We can see the pangolin, the mouse deer. This is the back of the pangolin using a culvert. The culvert is basically a drain underneath the road. And so we do maintain our culverts, meaning we make sure that it's unblocked so that the animals can use them to cross roads safely under the road. We also deploy our camera traps to look at arboreal animals. Arboreal animals meaning that they actually go on trees, they climb on trees. We use this to also collect baseline biodiversity information in the Central Nature Reserve. And you can see here on the yellow dots, you see actually a matrix of camera traps. And this allows us to actually measure densities of population of animals and detect what animals are using which part of the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. So for example, we actually know now that the wild boars actually like to hang around old oil palm plantation, and we know that their density is affected by the oil palm plantation. That they they can grow to a very large population at oil palm plantation, and we don't want that wild boar to grow unnaturally. They don't have natural predators. So what we do is having that knowledge, we actually reduce the oil palm plantation numbers, replace them with some of our native trees. Oil palms come from Africa, they're not native to Singapore. So, in effect, you're actually taking away the unnatural food of the wild boar, and this helps to reduce its population too. In our camera trap surveys, also we see a very nice thriving population of mouse deers as well. It's a nocturnal animal, and it's a legend of our folklore, the sun kanchu. There it is moving across. There's very big eyes, as you can see. These are some footages of animals. This is actually the Malayan porcupine using a culvert, and they move as a family. So it's very interesting to see this family of porcupines. And on the right, if you look at it very closely, you can see a leopard cat. They are very rare. They are the they are the only wild cat in Singapore left. We used to have tigers, but this is a leopard cat and it's a hunter and a top predator as well. Very elusive, but using camera traps, you can actually detect these animals. I'll talk more about radio tracking and GPS tracking as well. So you see a raptor here with a tracking device on its back, and we are able to track a lot of birds using this tracking device. It doesn't really impede the behavior of the animal. So the the one on the left here is actually data from a macaque. So you see many yellow dots there. It doesn't mean that each dot is a macaque, but it actually means that the collar, the GPS collar has pinged back its location at intervals that we fix, maybe every hour. So you sort of understand how this macaque has moved and what its range. And we usually collar the alpha male because the whole troop follows the alpha male. So by getting the data of the alpha male, you actually get the data of the entire troop, how it moves and where its territory. Likewise, we use this satellite collar to look at the movement of wild boars as well and look at its range and how it moves, especially within a forest. Does it even move across from one forest to another? This is actually a crocodile movement from Sungai Buloh. As you can see, it actually crosses the straits. And just like Singaporeans, we actually go, across the causeway and then come back as well. The crocodile does that. And this one of our recent endeavors, tracking of nesting turtles. It's interesting to see how they move. A lot of Singaporeans are very surprised that you can see these nesting turtles, and we do have quite a nice healthy population of nesting turtles in Singapore. As you can see that they go from Singapore to Indonesia as well. I just want to focus on this satellite tracking project that we have done across many years, and how some of that equipment has actually evolved in helping us track these migratory shorebirds even better. So every end of the year, if you go to Sungai Buloh, you see migratory birds that has traveled as far as the Arctic, all the way down to Sungai Buloh. They come from as far as Korea, China, Japan, and then they fly down. They fly down through Southeast Asia, and then they land in Singapore. And in the past, people observed them using their binoculars, and then after that, they started to radio track these animals. And then recently, they use GPS. So that GPS technology has really advanced our knowledge of these migratory shorebirds. So you can see that timeline. In the 90s, we were just using metal rings and flags. If you see a bird, migratory bird with a green flag on top of a red flag, then that belongs to Singapore. It's the international code for the birds in Singapore. Then as we go on, you can see that radio tracking was used, and this was not easy because you have to point the antenna at the bird to download the data as well. Then a very smart technology was also used, geolocator tracking. It looks at the amount of daylight that is that so it actually tracks the amount of daylight on the tracker, and you can from there actually judge where the bird is flying at which latitude. So, but that wasn't very accurate. So in the end, satellite tracking technology which arrived and was small enough to be put on the bird helped us understand that movement even more. So there are 9 major migratory flyways of water birds, and Singapore is part of this flyway. This East Asian Australasian flyway in the center is one of the largest flyways and the most threatened as well. So it's important that we share information of the birds that actually come from which country to Singapore, and then fly over to which country in the south as well. So together, right, this East Asian Australasian Flyway network was formed with different countries to better conserve shorebirds. Yeah, so we managed to publish in a very prestigious scientific journal, Nature Scientific Reports, and we demonstrated for the first time that these shorebirds, some of these shorebirds can actually fly across the Himalayan mountains to breeding grounds in China and Russia via a novel flyway to that we. I mean, it's not really novel to the birds, but novel to our understanding, a Central Asian flyway that traverses across, the latitudes. So it was previously thought that the elevation and the length of the Himalayan mountain range was a barrier for shorebirds migrating from Southeast Asia, but our satellite data showed otherwise. So this was very interesting to the scientific community, and we published this last year. You can see here, and Singapore, looking at Singapore is actually at the tip of sort of a promontory in this whole continental Asia, and the birds actually fly up and down, and you can see on this particular panel here that this new flyway was found. Just a short video to show the actual flight. So all these locations were gathered from the satellite tracker. This was put together by interns in Sungai Buloh Nature Reserve. So we had attached the tracker on the birds in December. Then by April, they fly up. Then the following year, before the winter comes again, they fly back down to Singapore. So this area here, this line here is the Himalayan mountains where India meets China. And the birds actually fly over about 4,000 over meters, and it's a tiny bird, and it's actually so after they refuel in Singapore, they actually go up to very to that height, about 4,000 plus meters, and then they maintain that height until they traverse through the valleys, the ridges in the Himalayan mountains, and cross it. So some of our other sensors that we use in wildlife management is this very interesting collaboration we had with LTA called Roadway Animal Detection System, and we deployed this in the old Upper Thomson Road. And what happens is that there's a set of CCTVs along the road. You can see them today, and these are connected to a signage that says animals ahead, and it lights up when an animal maybe 200 meters away actually crosses the path of these CCTVs. The CCTVs have artificial intelligence, and they recognize the silhouettes of animals because we have taught them how to do that through many images. And yeah, so they actually detect animals crossing the road. This is how it works. This is an example of how it works. You can see that a car is moving, and in front of it are some animals, and macaques are on the road itself, and so the car actually slows down. And so we have been studying this for a year to see if the car slow down when there are animals moving along the road, and it just shows how the efficacy of this system, and it looks very promising as well. Another thing that we use are not only images but also sound. So we use acoustic sensors as well. So this is an acoustic sensor to detect the roost size of Javan liners. These are non-native species, and we are finding ways on how to manage this. But we also need to understand the roost size and where they roost, and then the distribution of these miners. Instead of physically counting the birds, what we are doing now is we're employing the acoustic range and volume of these birds when they flock together. estimate the size of the flock. So these remote sensors that we use and these tools are not only used for animals, but also for tree management. Here you can see that we use LiDAR scans to actually do a finite element model simulation of trees. And by doing so, we actually can use the point cloud data from these LiDAR sensors to actually describe a tree. And from there, get data and look at whether the tree structure actually reaches safety levels. And so it allows us, it allows us to actually measure the tree without actually physically doing it, but using LiDAR data as well. And other than that, we also use multispectral analysis. And this on the left, you can see that you can actually measure the chlorophyll level of a stand of trees to access the tree health. So this is can be done remotely. The panoramic imagery of cameras also allows us to do visual checks of the trees. And then there's the wireless tree tilt sensors that we deploy. And this allows us to, because the data can be actually sent to us remotely through the network. This is the Internet of Things IoT sensors. It allows us to detect sudden tree movement and allows us to do timely risk mitigation as well. So there are other technologies that we use, resistograph to measure whether the wood has decayed in the tree as well, and a sonic tomograph to measure whether there are actually holes or weaknesses within the tree trunk. This is a short video of how we use drones to manage our trees and also to study biodiversity that is found on trees as well. So we do have tree climbers, but that's very laborious. Flying a drone is very much simpler. So we can actually do branch inspections and cavity inspections as well, without having to climb up. And in the forest, we can also do plant identification of orchids. The canopy of the trees is a very understudied realm in the forest for obvious reasons. In our arboretum, we also have a smart arboretum. In this arboretum, we actually grow a lot of these native dipterocarp trees found in Southeast Asia, and we're actually monitoring how they grow and actually matching their growth to factors that are found in the surrounding areas and how this influences their growth as well, such as humidity, the photosynthetic active range of light as well, and the temperature. So these sensors are again IoT sensors that help us detect that kind of atmospheric data that influence tree growth. So yeah, that's all that I have to share, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for your very, very interesting talk. Now, some of you would have seen the panel on the right that says Q&A, and you have noticed that actually 4 questions have been asked, and a lot of them have been answered by Adrian simultaneously while he was doing his very live and very interesting talk. And yeah, that's the level of efficiency we're talking about with regard to Adrian Lu. Now, the rest of you with very burning questions, right? There will be a Q&A session for all the panelists later on after the last speaker, Shawn Lum, has spoken. And I recommend that everybody takes notes right now, and then later on, just to have a more dynamic Q&A session, leave your Q&A questions for later on. So thank you again, Adrian. And it's very timely and very apt that you should end on the technologies that we are using for urban tree management. Now, Singapore actively manages about 6 to 7 million trees in the urban space. And you can imagine the sort of technology that we need to put into place, right, to make sure that everybody has a safe and comfortable relationship with the trees in our midst. So moving on, imagine, if you will, a probe that you can take, stick it into the ground, and then figure out whether the tree that you are trying to test, right, is at risk of disease or fungal infection. That leads us into the next talk by Dr. Hong Yan from NTU, who will tell you a little bit more about the e-nose system for detecting all sorts of diseases, fungal infections, by taking a probe of the soil. Take it away, Dr. Hong.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Hong Yan from NTU. So I'm going to talk about part of our research collaborative project with NParks. So without further delay, I would like to start sharing my screen with you. Okay, my topic today is e-nose for detecting wood decay fungi. So since it's part of it's ongoing process as part of our project, so I talk about our project first before introduction to e-nose and application. So we have we have studied to understand the fungi pathogens. We also try to understand the volatile associated with pathogenesis. We conducted e-nose analysis followed by machine learning and optimization. So many of you are experts directly involved in planning, planting, and maintenance of urban trees. It's difficult for me to emphasize the importance of the urban trees to Singapore. They are close to people physically and emotionally, becoming part of a society and a part of life, holding value in multiple ways. But just like human beings, they grow, they get sick, and the wood rot is a big problem to compromise the physical structure. So one contributing factors for the tree felling, especially during extreme weathers. This is the situations we have to manage. But just like human diseases, the best treatment is prevention. And preventive measures has to be based on science, has to be based on early diagnosis. So wood decay happens everywhere. So wood decay is mostly caused by two types of fungi. One is Basidiomycota and one is Ascomycota. So they can be subdivided based on the type of decay they cause: brown rot fungi, soft rot fungi, white rot fungi. Some of these fungi species are specific. They only attack certain plants and trees, whereas others are probably less specialized. So they're more opportunistic, and so they can be a member of the party. So in many instances, for a particular tree species, we may have a different type of fungi. Some are specialized and some are opportunistic as a part of consortium. So the wood rot include stem rot and a root rot. The root rot is harder to detect because it's underground but more dangerous, because the failure actually will cause bigger damage because the whole tree can fail. When we look at the scientific literatures, unfortunately, most root rot fungi have been studied for crops for the obvious reason of economical importance, but less on trees and even less on the root rot fungi for tropical urban trees. So there is a need to fill the knowledge gap. So we have this project under the M&D Research Fund. We had this 3-year project titled Rapid and Non-Invasive Detection of Incipient Tree Root Decay. Basically, we begin with study or survey the decay fungi or fungi consortium for the tree species of our interest. We have several trees. They are abundant. They've been planted. They're all around us. So we want to understand the fungi that will actually affect the health. We made use of this technology called fungi metagenomics profiling. And then we make use of SPME, GCMS together with e-Nose to understand the signatures of volatiles specific to ODK by the tree-specific fungi or fungi consortium. We got a pure fungi culture, and we make use of this fungi culture to recreate pathogenesis process by infecting tree saplings 2 to 3 years old. So we want to confirm actually the cause-effect relationship. And we will do the technology development of coming out of various complementary technologies for the purpose of diagnosis. But the star for my talk today is e-Nose. Let me introduce e-Nose. Basically, e-Nose is a group of electronic sensors. So these different sensors can respond to volatiles differently. So upon contact with volatiles, there's going to be some change in the resistance. So this signal will be recorded, processed to form some kind of a pattern. So different volatiles will give a different pattern, and then the pattern can be trained, memorized, and when a new sample is analyzed, it can be recognized. So basically, that's a principle for e-Nose, all right? So the modern version of e-Nose can be very sensitive. It can be as sensitive as human nose for some chemical structure, as illustrated in this table. So it's not hard to imagine that e-Nose has many possible applications. For example, to tell one red wine from another, or to tell the red wine from white wines, or from red wines from whiskey, for the quality control of food, for medical diagnosis, and of course for plant pathogen diagnosis as well. So on the left side, we have the state-of-the-art e-Nose, Ceranose 320. So it is shaped and sized like a miniature walkie-talkie, right? So to begin with, the fresh air is purged through this inlet to build a baseline response. And then there's a needle, sampling needle on the top. We'll get in touch with the volatile, and the responses of each sensor is being recorded in the form of a scrolling script chart or in the form of smell print. So each response, this is delta R, is a difference in resistance. So it's represent a response for each sensor. So this is 32-dimension data, and this data can be converted into 2D or 3D data for the so-called clustering analysis. There have been a lot of interest with some promising results for plant pathogen pest diagnosis. So people are interested not only, fungi, but also bacteria and the various plant pests. There have been a lot of interest, a lot of promising results. You can refer to the table for more details, but in general speaking, sensitivity and specificity are the main challenges to e-Nose. And for each particular applications, optimization and improvements are generally needed. So in the end of the day, e-Nose is typically used in conjunction with other diagnosis methods. So upon receiving this e-Nose, we put immediately to the test. So e-Nose test is pretty straightforward for the pure chemicals. So in this case example, we use the e-Nose to test 3 samples. One is air, one is turpentine, and one is acetic acid. As you can see that this is a 3D clustering of the 3 data points for each of the sample. They are very well clustered, as indicated by the very big interclass M distances and also the internal validation. So it's a 100% accuracy. When we apply the unknown samples after training for the identification purpose, the identification accuracy was 100%, as you expect. But the e-nodes getting more complicated when we apply to more complicated samples like soil samples. So on the left side, you have the clustering of the 85 e-nodes tested soil samples from 7 tree species. So it looks like there's no straightforward, straight line you can really divide the disease from the healthy ones, right? It looks disappointing, but hardly surprising, because we know that volatiles actually are also contributed by many other factors. Other than the health conditions, the different tree species, different soil type, other microorganisms present in the soil, and even moisture level, and a possible location can all be contributors to volatile profile. So it is not so straightforward. When we want to be making use of e-nodes for the early detection of volatile organic compounds associated with wood rot, we have few challenges. Challenge number one is biological relevance. So whatever difference has to be, associated with the fungi or with the fungus or fungi consortium that's called the wood decay. The volatile profile has to have some kind of good specificity. Detection has to be accurate above background noises. We know that many other contributors to the background noises. Hopefully, the detection has to happen at an earlier stage. So that requires high sensitivity. And the last but not least, it has to be physical, field feasible. So we have some answers, but we don't have all the answers to all the questions yet. So we have, through the metagenomics analysis of soil, fruiting bodies, and disease tissues collected from urban trees around Singapore. So this is actually a short form of our understanding of the wood rot fungi. Okay, so we're making use of metagenomic analysis, meaning that we isolate total DNA from the soil and the disease tissues, amplify the sequence tags of all for all the fungi, and sequence them. So the sequence tags can be used to identify the fungi present, and the frequency of the same tag represented in a big number of data like 50,000 or 10,000 data, right? It will give us some kind of semi-quantitative idea how dominant this particular fungus in the sample, all right? So in this table, we also try to have some kind of star ranking to indicate the dominance. So if a fungus is present in a sample in more than 5% of the total hits, we give 1 star, 5 to 50%, 2 star, and more than 50%, 3 star. All right, 2 and 3 star indicate the dominance of the fungi in the sample. All right, we also sequence or molecular identify the fruiting bodies. All right, so based on the currents, we also give them a ranking. So you can take a look, and quite fast you can identify the rigidoporous, microporous is a big threat to rain trees because it's dominant in the disease and occur in multiple cases for fruiting bodies, and is also present in the soil. So it looks like, it is special for the rain tree. It's especially damaging to the rain trees. In comparison, another, the wood rot fungi, Falciformis species 2012b, it is wider presence, not only impacting rain trees, but also affecting yellow flame, ansana, casuarina, and the sea apple. It is also present in kaya trees. Serpula similis is a dry rot fungus which is mostly affecting our Ansana and the Phineus loxus. It seems so far is a specialist for kaya trees. It's a dominant presence in the diseased tissue, but interestingly, so far we have yet to find its fruiting body, and its presence in the soil is very minimal. So that gives ideas what are the fungi possibly impact of urban trees. But I mean, association is not all, right? So we have the pure culture, as we say, our pure culture for some of this fungi species, and we try to recreate the pathogenesis process through infecting the tutu tree, the tree saplings. So this is ongoing work. All right. So concurrently, we try to analyze what volatiles are involved in this wood rot process. So we know that the GCMS is a very advanced technique, can identify the chemical structure of the volatile very accurately. We adopted a very new technology called solid phase microextraction to make sampling much easier and straightforward, and the cost of operation lower. So in simple terms, so this fiber can be inserted into sample vials to attract volatiles, and this fiber can be directly injected into sample chamber of GCMS. So through this analysis, our first question is whether the pathogenic fungi are different from each other. So we subject the two pure fungi culture into the SPME GC-MS analysis. So you can clearly see that these two fungi may share some of these volatiles, but yet they're very distinct from each other. So next question we ask is, if these fungi infect the plant, so what will happen? Do they have a different volatile profile? So we use a rubber stick infected by falciformis and a rubber stick infected by Phineus loxus and subject to the same analysis. You can clearly see that actually the infection to the same material by different fungi, they do have different volatile profile. So these two slides give us some kind of confidence and give us some scientific support that the fungi infection can have specific volatile profile that can be detected by GC-MS. And we subject to the same rubber sticks to the e-nodes analysis. What will happen? Although you can clearly see that Phineus loxus, falciformis, and control, meaning that the rubber stick only. Clustering is okay, although it's not perfect. But the accuracy of identification, if we use this data for the training purpose, the accuracy can reach 90%, which is quite encouraging. When you see the interclass M distances, at least Phineus loxus and the falciformis infected rubber stick are clearly different from each other. So that is encouraging and consistent with the GC-MS analysis. All right, let's come back to e-nodes data processing. When we have a lot of data, we have to make use of the machine learning to help us for the better classification. So this slide illustrates that how we do it with a support vector machine mechanism for the purpose to find the right hyperplane for the best classification. So this algorithm basically, what it does is that it will make part of the data as a training set and it use another part of the data as a test set. So it will just randomly select the training set and test set and do this kind of model building and validation multiple times. So they are going to get the maximum again, to get optimize the training set to be used. All right, so this is so in this we have done this training by making use of 55 data points for the healthy trees, and 55 out of 165 random sample disease data points for this kind of SVM linear machine learning process. You can see that each sampling, you can have different accuracy level, and the best accuracy level was 79, but you do know that actually accuracy level varies with sampling. That's an indication that the samples are not uniform, right? So there is a variation. Okay, we subject the same samples to the other algorithm analysis. So the accuracy levels was more or less in the same range. The best accuracy level was 81% by random forest. Our target is to achieve ACC of more than 90%. So, this is a work in process. There are a lot to do and there are more to learn. So we are using e-Nose to monitor pathogenesis of tree saplings. We collect and analyze more samples that are better defined. Continuously, we use machine learning to improve classification, increase accuracy of diagnosis. Moving forward, we can make use of those signature volatile to train the e-Nose. We are planning to start a field trial for those scenarios with good classification, reasonable accuracy. In the end of the day, we don't think e-Nose is the only one solution for diagnosis. Most likely, it is going to be used together with other technologies like SPME GCMS, PCR diagnosis, etc., for higher confident diagnosis. This is my last slide. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the partners. So those names highlighted, they're the direct contributors to the e-Nose work. Special thanks to our unpassed collaborators. Without their strong support, we cannot move so far. So that's the end of my talk. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. It was a fascinating presentation by you, and we've learned a lot about how to detect remotely all the compounds that are given out by any sort of disease and fungal organisms. Now, very interestingly, that we are talking about city in nature, and we're talking about city which is built on ground, and nature which requires soil to grow on, right? So it's very interesting that when we are talking about buildings and we are talking about nature and ecosystems and trees and greenery, we don't really have too much discussion actually in the public sphere about the soil on which all these things grow and are placed on, right? And very interestingly, also the relationship between the soil and the water when it comes down in the form of rain and groundwater. Now, here to basically enlighten us about these things, particularly in the face of climate change, totally live is Dr. Li Yangyang from NTU to talk to you about island-wide soil mapping project and water balance modeling. Take it away, Dr. Li.
Hi everyone, I'm Yang from NTU, and today I would like to share with you our research on this topic, GIS-based water balance model for Singapore, incorporating spatially varied soil properties and land covers. And to develop the database, first we need to filter out some basic soil properties. In this, for example, the plastic liquid limit, and fines content. And we are only focusing on depth, on shallow soil depth, which is 0 to 2 meters, because that is where roots usually sit in. Yeah, and we want to we want to filter out these soil properties because they are quite basic and they usually decide what soil is like. And yeah, so from these few properties, we can use machine learning, which is the artificial neural network in this research, to predict the soil hydraulic properties, which are A, N, M, theta S, and Ks is the saturated permeability based on the filtered soil properties. And then ordinary kriging method was used to obtain the spatial distribution within Singapore for each soil property. And based on the spatial distributions, Singapore was divided into different zones with similar range of soil properties. And so we have like a summary of different properties in each zone, and that's what we call a database. So this shows the distribution of the boreholes we have, and is distributed inside Singapore. So it's a combination of both NTU testing records and also the borehole data from public agencies. And just to introduce a bit of this AN we use. So for input layer, what we have is liquid limit, plastic limit, and also fines content. And for the output layer, there's only one node. For example, if you want to predict the soil hydraulic saturated permeability, then this one is the saturated permeability. And for the hidden layers, actually we need to try different number of hidden layers and different number of nodes inside each layer to obtain the optimum network. When we say optimum, we mean that the error is the minimum. And so after we have the prediction of all the soil properties, so we know, okay, inside each borehole location, what are the soil hydraulic properties? However, we don't know other locations. That's why we need to use ordinary kriging method to spatialize, to interpolate the soil properties between those known points. And that's why we use the ordinary kriging method. And in the end, we have the spatial distributions of A and M, the saturated volumetric water content, and also PS, the saturated permeability. And then Singapore was divided into 97 zones based on the distribution of the soil properties. So for each zone, there is we calculate the mean value of the cells inside each zone, and that will be the values for that zone. And so this shows the distribution of the parameter A inside SWCC. So we can see there is a higher value in the west, and so it's just calculate from the spatial distribution. And similarly, N and M here. And also we also have the spatial distribution of the theta S and also the summarized theta S for each zone. This is the saturated volumetric water content, meaning that when the soil is fully saturated, what is the moisture content? And as we know in Singapore, the fines content in the west is higher. We have more fines like clay and silt. So there will be a higher, soil can hold more water when it's fully saturated, and the volumetric water content when it's saturated is very high. As indicated in the color here. And similarly, for this saturated permeability, there are more fines in the west, but less fines, more coarse green materials in the east. So when it's coarse green material, it will have a larger permeability compared to the fines material. That's why we have a larger permeability here with more sandy materials. And then I will introduce more on our water balance model. We use geotop in this research, and this is a very powerful software because it can simulate the precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, and it's a terrain-based, so we can use you can incorporate the DM model, the slope angle, and it's a 3D flow. And we can also incorporate the different land cover properties. And yeah, so it can calculate both the water balance and the energy balance. So the water balance, it can simulate the 3D flow in unsaturated soils. And however, the relationship between which is SWCC density equation, the relationship between VWC, the volumetric water content, and matrix section. They use Van Newton equations. So we need to transform from freezing to Van Newton. And the energy balance is very important because it can estimate the evapotranspiration based on the incorporation, based on the weather conditions, and it can incorporate different land cover properties. Yeah. So for we have our inputs like the maps and also soil properties, weather conditions, and then we calculate energy balance and mass balance. Then we will have our output. And the typical inputs are the maps, the DEM, slope angle, aspect, land cover, and groundwater table, and also the soil properties, hydraulical properties, and also the weather conditions. And also the typical outputs are soil moisture content, water pressure height, evapotranspiration rate, and groundwater table. Yeah, so this shows the DM map of Singapore. The highest elevation is near the Bukit Timah mountain. It's about 163 meters, and this shows the slope angle map, aspect map. Oh, so when it shows -1, it means it's flat. Yeah, so usually inside the reservoir is a flat area. That's why the aspect is -1. And this shows the groundwater table map. So when it's in the high slope or high elevation area, the groundwater table is also deeper. And this is also the land cover map we use. So we classify the Singapore into 5 categories, which are grassland, forest, building, road, and water body. Yeah, and this shows the results of volumetric water content for some typical days. And so example, and because it's a regional analysis, so we can see, okay, the results for the whole area. And for day 1 is there's no rainfall, and it's similar to the initial condition, and the volumetric water content is more dependent on the groundwater table, initial groundwater table, and the lowest is about 0.34. However, in day 4 there was a rainfall, and then we can see the minimum volumetric water content increases from 0.34 to 0.4 because there was some rainwater infiltration. And in day 10, there's no rainfall, and we can see, okay, it drops again, the minimum water content, and the whole area becomes red again compared to day 5, meaning it's getting drier, and due to evapotranspiration. And in the last day, the day 30, there was a higher rainfall compared to day 5, and we can see it's becoming higher, much higher compared to day 5. Sorry, so it's almost 0.5, 0.489 here, and the whole area becoming very blue now, and meaning it's getting more saturated. Yeah. And we can look at the results at the CE slope, and the purple circles shows the results from the database using GeoTop, and the triangle shows our monitor results from the moisture sensors at each depth, and the blue the square shows the results from GeoTop, but using the lab data we saw for soils at different depths. And we can see that the trend are generally correct and similar for these three methods. And however, the soil database have a higher volumetric water content, and this could be due to the difference in the SWCC, because our database has a higher saturated water content, which is at 0.57. For our lab testing is in the range between 0.44 to 0.49. And also, we can also try to run the model under the dry condition to see, okay, how much moisture content that the soil can decrease, and see the results of that. And so we use some historical extreme weather conditions in Singapore. And this shows the results. So we can see after 1 day, 10 days, 20 days, and 30 days, it's getting much and much drier as the whole area gets more and more red, and also the minimum water content is decreasing. And the interesting part for this is when we try to calculate difference between day 1 and day 30, which is this plot, we can see the maximum change occurs in the red area, and this is exactly our forest forest land cover. So when the field cover with forest, there has a highest drop in the moisture content because higher evapotranspiration rate. And you may think that the minimum is still okay, it's 0.459, it's not so much. It's not like 0.1 or 0.2. However, if you take a look at this research, this shows the research on the crabgrass. So they show that at different sections, how will the leaves go? So it will go like start to turn yellow at 300 kilopascal. And if you calculate our SWCC, so 300 kilopascal, the volumetric water content is about 0.455. However, after 30 days of our dress condition, the minimum volumetric water content goes to 0.459, meaning that there could be some crabgrass turning into yellow already. And this is an interesting result, and we think that model can be applied in more areas. And thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I will be glad to discuss with you.
Thank you very much for your interesting and engaging presentation, Dr. Li. And now we have the final speaker and presenter for us today at this webinar. And he's extremely well known. He is Dr. Shawn Lum from NTU, renowned tropical forest ecologist. And he's here to tell us about the long-term monitoring of plots in an urban forest and how important this means for us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Shawn.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shawn Lum. I'm a lecturer at the NTU Asian School of the Environment, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon at the M&T Urban Sustainability R&D Symposia. Thank you very much, and to Dr. Shimona Kwazi, my colleague at NParks, who invited me and has really helped me put this presentation together. Thank you. I'm especially grateful, and to all of you for being here. I'd like to really share with you some of the work that me and my colleagues have been doing over the years in our forests and trying to understand how that might be related or what the implications are of this research for better planning and managing our city and nature. Of course, Singapore is an urban city-state, but we do have a lot of nature. And so a few points really, if we just get right into it, what would make for a sustainable, thriving city and nature? So first of all, I think there's a few basic points. One is that although Singapore is largely urban, most of its nature is not what we would call urban biodiversity, but it's actually the wildlife that's associated with natural ecosystems or wildlife. So that's one thing to note. Secondly, I think if we want to have resilience and sustainability in our habitats, we need them to be sufficiently large to support robust ecosystems and populations of plants and animals. These populations and habitats need to be adequately protected and managed, especially to have a few core areas that really anchor the diversity and ecological function of our green areas. Next, we need populations of wildlife and plants that are sufficiently large to be sustainable over time, that capture enough genetic variation within these species so that they don't inbreed, for example. And another thing which could be interesting is that I think having these ecosystems, which we'll consider communities of plants and animals, if they have a minimum number of species that allow ecosystem processes to take place, that would be ideal. Finally, to have them connected across the landscape, either through a direct physical contact or continuous belt of greenery, for example, or to be connected in other ways, such as the movement of pollinators or seed dispersers, what we might call gene flow. That would be very good to have. And finally, I think if we were to anticipate the potential impacts of climate change in the decades ahead, that would be very helpful as well. So before I talk about Bukit Timah, I just want to, and other habitats, you know, we have marine habitats too. Here's the Labrador Nature Reserve, and this is the Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve. I'd like to take a very quick detour. 8 years ago, I gave a talk at the URA. I remember being really nervous, by the way, like I am right now. And this was trying to take basic ecological principles and see how they could be put into practice in our, at that time it was called City in a Garden. And these are just real, not rocket science, just basic ecology, saying that, you know, to maintain biodiversity, large areas were preferable to small, that they be buffered, that they be a mixture of, in terms of structure and species diversity, as opposed to homogeneous and manicured, that they be connected rather than isolated, and that they be, you know, thoughtfully planned out with the ecosystem or the habitats in mind and the conditions that they require. And of course, we see that all in practice today with our city in nature. And it's not that this talk 8 years ago had any influence. It's just that this talk was based on basic ecological principles, just as our city in nature, its management is based on fundamental ecological principles as well. What I also was thinking 8 years ago was that we can create new habitats and not just rely on what's existing, protect what we have and recreate, if we can, in areas that are set aside for nature and for greenery, and that these habitats, both existing and restored, be monitored and managed over time. And finally, they will not work unless there is a buy-in from the general public, getting the community involved, which we also see as a major component of our city in nature. Lastly, I think I went on to say that not everybody likes nature. So how do we maximize good interactions, minimize unpleasant interactions, and have a very progressive outreach scheme? It's basically, it requires us to kind of change our value system to respect and to even cherish the wildlife that shares this space with us, rather than seeing them as a nuisance or competitors. Of course, there are limits, you know, to our tolerance, and there are safety issues, but in general, a community that embraces nature will become a more thriving city in nature than one that isn't a community that embraces nature. So what have I learned really in the past decade since I gave that talk at the URA? Quite a number of things, as it turns out. And what I'd like to do now for the next few minutes is to share some of the results of our work at Bukit Timah. So first of all, if you look at Bukit Timah compared to the original vegetation map of Singapore, Bukit Timah would be somewhere right there as a small little pocket, 50 hectares of original primary forest, as opposed to what was 500 square kilometers originally. So Bukit Timah is just a tiny fragment of the original rainforest that clothed the island. And already by the 1870s, over 90%, 95% almost of that original forest habitat had already been cleared. Much of it that could be saved, or what little that could be saved and set aside as forest reserve by the British was, but that was not until the 1880s. There's Bukit Timah right over there. So how is this little fragment faring at Bukit Timah? Much of what we understand is the ecology of fragments is based on some work that was done in the Amazon. But if you look, for example, here's Bukit Timah in the 1950s, so 70 years ago, you can really see there's a clear demarcation between the forest and the area that's not protected. Some of these surrounding areas that are not part of the forest reserve, however, managed to regenerate to what's called secondary forest in the decades that followed. And so you can see that the area surrounding Bukit Timah is quite a bit greener or forested, vegetated than it was even 30, 40 years previously. As I was saying, the work in the Amazon suggests that fragmentation of habitats leads to some fairly catastrophic results in terms of drops in species diversity, losses of big trees, or what's called biomass, the amount of living material that's there. What I call edge effects, where these habitats fray from the outside and work their way inwards, sometimes a few hundred meters. So by these standards, Bukit Timah should be an ecosystem in real trouble. Have there been things like species loss? And the answer is yes, in terms of mammals, bees, butterflies, birds. There are fewer species today than, say, even 30 or 40 years ago, but on a slow decline, not a catastrophic decay. And in fact, it could be that these species have reached some sort of equilibrium value, that the habitat is large enough to support a certain number of wildlife species. So there's been losses, but again, not catastrophic. And has that translated into some nasty ecological downstream effects? That's what we'd like to know. So first, has this system collapsed in terms of biomass, for example? And evidence suggests not really, no, because if you look at Bukit Timah, this is the biomass per unit area. Bukit Timah is right in the, slightly on the lower side, but right within the average range of biomass for other Asian tropical forests. And in fact is quite comparable to similar forests in Africa, primary forests in Africa, or even on the high side if you compare it to the American tropical forests. So over a period of 25 years, 1993 to today, that should be 2021 actually, sorry, biomass levels are similar. There have been no net losses of species. The tree density, the forest structure is similar to what it was when we started the study, which implies that these core forest areas can remain relatively stable, surprisingly stable over time. We don't see the kinds of catastrophic collapses that have been documented for the Amazon. Now, with fragments also, there's a worry amongst the ecological community that they become vulnerable to exotic species, invasions. And so if we look here at Bukit Timah, there's a pocket of that forest that used to be a grassland, the dairy farm, mostly dominated by the African tulip tree, exotic species from Africa. But we cannot find African tulip trees within the native dominated forest. And in fact, we do not see other common exotic species such as albizia or acacia in the native forest either. So that suggests that these native habitats are relatively resilient to invasive species. So that's good, that's positive, encouraging. Now, how about ecosystem processes such as seed dispersal? So if you consider a large seeded species, so an extreme example such as this nutmeg in the lower left-hand corner, it is 5 centimeters across. That's a big seed, and it's dispersed by wildlife such as large-bodied hornbills, gibbons, and basically large mammals, which are absent from our forests today. But despite that, we found that the distribution of these large-seeded plants is very similar, comparable to what we find in intact forests in the region. So there didn't seem to be a kind of loss in dispersal function, despite the absence of these large animals. What could be the reason? We surmise that some of the smaller bodied mammals, such as squirrels, forest rats, and so on, macaques, civet cats, have taken up the slack and still function quite effectively in seed dispersal. So once again, we don't necessarily need the original mammal and bird fauna to be able to see these forest processes in play today. Here's a study that was done by Professor Ted Webb in his lab at NUS. This was the movement of pollen in the tall tree species, Compasia or Compass. And essentially what Ted Webb and his colleagues did was mapped these trees, which are found really only in primary forest fragments. And he was able to find that pollen, using genetic markers, able to find that pollen moved, for example, from trees at McRitchie and pollinated trees in Bukit Timah, or pollinated trees down at the Botanic Gardens. Likewise, pollen moved from Bukit Timah to McRitchie, and also Bukit Timah from the Botanic Gardens. And incredibly, trees at the Botanic Garden were siring, were fathering seedlings in McRitchie. So this is movement presumably by large honeybees, the Apis dorsata. So some trees, despite being relatively far apart, are still able to are held together as one effective population through the agency of certain pollinators, like giant honeybees, or cave nectar bats, other strong flying animals. So imagine moving through that landscape, not all forest, it's through some suburban and urban areas as well. I find that absolutely incredible and very encouraging. In other words, I feel we could really use our landscapes as a way. If you look here, for example, as the Bukit Timah corridor, by planting Compasia or other trees where the pollen is moved long distances, we can actually expand the population of native trees into urban and suburban networks, because we know that the pollen actually is effectively moved across the landscape by certain pollinators. That leads to the final thing, which is, so why am I showing a 1970 Dodge Charger? So this is a car my father owned and for over 10 years. And by the time I was learning to drive, it was held together kind of by rust, basically. It lost some parts, and I put a few dents in the car as well. But we found it even later, after my father had given it away. Another family, we saw it on the road. At that time, it was held together by duct tape, and parts of the car were missing. So that made me think, what do you need to keep a car going? So you could lose, I mean, it wouldn't be safe necessarily, but you could lose the windscreen wipers, you could lose the windscreen even, you could lose the lights, you could lose the hubcaps and the bonnet. And essentially, if you could strip it down to the basics, what would you have? You might end up with a kind of Fred Flintstone mobile, where it's just a chassis and wheels and some power, furnished in this case by Fred's feet, courtesy of Fred's 2 feet. And it still works. So I'm not saying that Bukit Timah is the forest equivalent of a Fred Flintstone mobile, but Bukit Timah and Singapore's forests have enough components in them to actually keep these robust and sustainable over decades, probably even over centuries. I'm quite optimistic, and they'll do better when we enrich them over time as well. So as a brief summary, really, species may be important, but if we focus on the functioning of these systems, I think that can help us better design a resilient city in nature, to understand what are the components that can move around and which are the components that really must stay and are restricted to core nature areas. To think not only of trees and big wildlife, but to look at other components of the forest ecosystem, such as decomposition or the cycling of nutrients, uptake of carbon, and so on. And not to forget, there's a lot of stuff going on in the soil as well. There were 2 caveats out of our work. One is that the trees have been shifting over time in terms of their relative abundance. So if you look here on the right, these are different species at Bukit Timah that have shown relatively dramatic changes over the past 25 years. Some, such as Strelblus, which is otherwise known as Tempanese, have increased by almost 40%. Others, such as the Rengas, the gluta, have decreased by 20% or more, and other things have decreased by over 30%. So they're still in the forest, but in much lower numbers. So that means that there have been shifts in the relative composition. The forest conditions might be changing. We want to understand this better, of course, but if you look at work that's been done elsewhere, and this is work done by Ken Feely, our colleague in Florida, studying the forest of Barro Colorado Island in Panama, he's found that these species have shifted over time too, to favor what appear to be drought tolerant species. So there are these changes in response, presumably, to climate change. Again, we need to better understand this, but if the climate shifts, the implication is that forest composition and the species that do well under these changing conditions, we will see some changes. And if the better we anticipate these changes, the better we can manage this city and nature. Second thing, we can find vegetation recovering almost instantaneously the moment you leave land to sit fallow, but to bring back the primary forest takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. It's very slow. Chua Su-chin and other colleagues have found this out from Bukit Timah and other places. But the flip side is that if we're really planning on a scale of decades or even centuries, there's essentially no hurry to start planting everything now. I think we can wait long enough to get the right species mix, to find the seeds, to plant them strategically, to manage it. So we can do a lot of the groundwork for the city and nature and the 1 million trees now. But I think if we really want to properly restore native systems, there's no rush. Not to say there's no urgency, but there's no rush to start doing it before we're really ready or have the right plant material. And finally, just a few takeaways before I end. I think the landscape can be really used strategically to boost the function of our native forest and core ecosystems. Luckily, we use these ecological principles to manage this city and nature. By focusing on the function of these systems, I think that will allow us to plan better how we want to design and manage the city and nature. And by anticipating changes in the environment in the decades ahead, we'll have a more resilient city and nature. Finally, we may be pretty okay ecologists in Singapore, but we're not magicians. So we work within the rules of ecology and with the backing of the public, without which the city and nature really cannot thrive in the way we imagine it and what's possible. And I hope that together we'll have a better city and nature for all of us, for our children and their children. I wish to thank you once again for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have later. Again, I thank the organizers, and most of all, thank all of you.
All right, thank you so much, Shawn. That was edutainment at its very best. Now, can I invite all the panelists, all 4 panelists, to unmute yourselves and turn on your videos? And for anybody now who's been holding on to their questions, ready to ask, please pop in the questions at the Q&A section. You can see on the lower right-hand side of your Zoom chat. Type out the questions that you have to address the panelists with. Now, while people are typing in their questions so that I can curate them and then ask specific panelists which the questions are directed to, let's warm ourselves up for a while. Now, here we are talking about the city in nature, right? And the city in nature is a really, really interesting, unique vision. Unique amongst all the world. We have a tiny little island state, 710, 720 square kilometers. We have 5 million people, 6 million people crammed into it, right? And we still want something whereby we can really live in harmony and have a total green matrix, conserve our green spaces. And when we are talking about conservation, we are talking about being conservative, right? Don't do anything, just keep everything as is. But at the same time, in Singapore, when we're talking about city in nature, we are talking about really, really intense application of science, technology, innovations to solve the challenges that we have trying to coexist with nature in a first world infrastructure. So one by one, and it's directed to all of you, but maybe we'll start with Adrian first. Do you think there are limits to what science and technology can solve for us in this effort that we are trying to make to basically coexist in nature, coexist harmoniously with nature, have infrastructure that somehow benefits nature as well as draws benefits from nature? Is there a limit to what science and technology can do? Adrian, starting with you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jim. And thanks to the other panelists for a very insightful talks and all that. And yeah, Sean ended with the fact that it still involves people, the public, and that's why we have the 1 million trees movement, so that we can galvanize the public as well. So science and tech informs us, and it sort of leads the foundation, the framework, but ultimately is our resolve, as a community, and also in our habits also as well. So everybody has a role to play in this city in nature. Yeah.
Okay. How about Dr. Hong? What are your views?
I think science can do a lot of value adding to nature, but of course there is a limit. So especially the big environment surrounding us, we probably out of our hands to change, but we have to live with it. But in a small ecosystem we're living in, we can do a lot about it. We can do a good management. That's how I feel.
Thank you very much for your views. Dr. Li, what do you think?
I think that the science and technology are very important in the first step. For example, because in Singapore it's very big, so we cannot monitor everywhere. Then we need to know, okay, where is more sensitive to drought or to highest rainfall, so we can do more on the particular area. But to do this, we need to know have a idea before we apply anything there, instrumentations or any repair or anything measures we take. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So essentially having the background knowledge, having fundamental understandings of all the systems and the processes that basically guide ecology, ecosystems, and habitats will allow us to better have an interface with infrastructure. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sean, your views? I know we're not magicians.
No, thank you. Yeah, so nice to see all of you. Thank you, Jim. No, I monitoring, management, the research, I mean, all of that, the more technology that we have to enhance what we know and what we can do is of course, that's priceless. But ultimately, I think if we're talking certainly about biodiversity, it boils down to how much area can be set aside for wildlife. That's one. And then, of course, can we connect those up? And parks are doing a great job of that now. And maybe the last thing, and I think it's maybe more than technology, it's people's attitudes. And are we willing to coexist with nature? Or are we going to support the authorities in their efforts? You can have a country such as India, for example, over 1 billion people. Of course, it's a large landmass, but yet they still have tigers and one-horned rhinoceros. They protect these despite the economic conditions of local populations, but because I think there's some fundamental values that they have. And so I think the people component needs to work hand in hand with the technology.
Right. Thank you so much. I think also one of the fundamental principles here is that science and technology is great, but while we are sitting here in Singapore talking about science and technology and really all these fancy things that we are using, all these fancy methods, all these fancy tech that we have to address all these challenges with regard to conservation, actually innovation can be cheap, innovation can be simple. Innovation doesn't need to cost tens of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, right? So all it takes is a willingness to think out of the box and find a solution which is totally different from what had been practiced before. You brought up India, and India, very great story in conservation is the story of Jadav Payeng, right? The forest man of India. And all it took was one man, and he replanted an entire forest on his own, single-handedly, and that's because he decided to think out of the box. Where was he living and what the environment was, and he decided to make a change, and making a change is innovation in its own right. And I think if everybody in the community in Singapore pulls together with the vision and buys into the vision of city in nature, all the technologies that we are blessed to have because we are a first world economy, that essentially can help us so much in answering all these questions. All right, So that brings us to one of the questions that was typed out, and it's an interesting question. The upcoming Singapore coastal defense system for the next 100 years is likely to create hundreds of hectares of coastal polders, which again is an interesting point of discussion if you want to talk about polders and how different it is to reclamation and what sort of land is left after you build a polder. Nature conservationists could quickly take this rare opportunity to carve out habitats for more flora and fauna and not give all to buildings. What opportunities do the panelists see exist here? Maybe I direct that first to Dr. Li. Now, with regard to polders, right, we are talking about a really special type of land that's left to use. When we're talking about polders, right? It's building an embankment around what used to be sea space, pumping out the water and then leveling out the ground there. Do you see any opportunities to plan in advance such that polders are not all infrastructure and give some space for nature? What do you think?
So polders mean like is the powder or?
No, it's like what the Dutch do. Rather than just putting soil into the sea so that you reclaim, what they do is they build an embankment around it and then they pump out the water. So what's left is below sea level, but it's a different kind of ground because it used to be the seabed, right? So these are interesting things that we have to think about when we want to use this sort of reclamation technique. And then thereafter try to bring in nature into it because there is salinity that you have to talk about, the fact that the soil is a different composition. So do you think, is it possible, for example, to introduce nature into a place which is quite saline and quite clayey? Yes, something like that.
Okay, so for the marine, I mean for the soil under the sea is usually very weak. It's like more like clay. And what we do, we usually do a lot of like soil treatments there before we have any buildings or embankments, anything there. And so however, for the greeneries or like vegetation plants, actually we are more focusing on the topsoil. Meaning that, but for the buildings and it's deeper. Definitely it should be deeper, like using the pails or anything like very anchored very deep into the soil. But so on the top soil, I think we can put like a few hundred centimeters of a good soil for the vegetation to grow, and that should be no problem. I mean, no conflicts on those. That is my opinion.
Right. It's interesting. Adrian, what do you think about polders and introducing nature into space and land that's provided by polders?
Yeah, I think it can be, like hybrid technology and, nature-based solutions, So in certain areas where there are, can have some inlets where you get propagation of mangroves as well. And over time, these mangroves can even protect that kind of polders, And what you see is they adapt naturally to the salinity. And then as the salinity wears down, right, mangroves are potentially quite key to this, right? I mean, they will adapt to this kind of nature-based solution because they can live in brackish water, saline water, or more or less fresh water sometimes. So I think there's an opportunity to have mangroves. And mangroves, as you know, can be a very nice habitat, for as nurseries, where the fish can actually have their fry. And then finally, when the small fish grow up and swim outside, they become, our food, right? So it also contributes to things like, our sustainability of our marine stock as well. Yeah. So that I think that's a quick take on that.
Yeah. And I think the subtext there is that if we then want to do something about it, the planning and the thinking has to really, really happen well in advance. Because it takes decades to settle. Right. Okay. Shawn, there's a question for you. Which is from the ecological viewpoint, is planting 1 million trees in 10 years going to have a positive impact in terms of both biodiversity and sustainability?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Chowen, for the question, by the way. Of course, planting even one tree is better than planting none. I mean, but that's a trivial answer. I think planting trees to create habitats would be optimal, and then planting a tree mix that actually enhances the existing secondary vegetation that kind of dominates our forested landscape would be even better. So I think already 1 million trees is a good start. But then, as I had mentioned in the slide presentation, I think if we did it in a very strategic way, what's the species mix? What are we trying to accomplish ecologically? How do we match the trees to the wildlife and to the type of ecosystem we're trying to recreate? And using the best science that's been presented by the other panelists, I think this would be the way to really maximize our use of those 1 million trees. So, which is why I also said, I think it's great to involve community and get the buy-in and so on. But in terms of just recreating the habitat, it's an urgent need, long-term need, but we don't necessarily have to rush it all at one go, but better to do it in an ecologically appropriate way.
Right. Thank you so much. That's a great answer, which actually leads into this question by the Tobias about volunteering opportunities. We love to hear that sort of question. Volunteering opportunities, please head on down to the NParks website and portal. Tons of volunteering opportunities, both community nature programs as well as 1 million tree planting programs. So Tobias, I hope you visit our website and avail yourselves of these many opportunities.
If I can also jump in, Jim, I think, you know, I mean, the four of us, five of us here on the panel, we can do research till the cows come home, and we could do a lot. But when you have 50,000 people contributing to citizen science efforts, my God, we can do so much more, you know. Exactly. So I really think you can do more than just volunteer. There's so many things that you can put those skills to, and raise the capacity of the rest of us so that we all advance.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna jump in here. Yeah. So besides I just want to direct Tobias to the Trees SG web page, TREES SG. Just type that in your Google, and then you'll come to the NParks website where you can actually volunteer for the 1 million trees movement. And we have compiled a lot of resources there as well, so you can actually watch webinars that we have on there. Shawn Lum gives a very nice documentary in the forest as well. Yeah.
Related question here, is there a minimum quantum in area or percentage of the city area? And for Singapore, it's just the national area because we are a city state, right? That has to be set aside for nature to be sustainable.
That was a thank you. Anybody can take it. That was Mike's question, and I looked at it, and it's, you know, it's actually a very fundamental thing that people in conservation biology do. I think people have called this, for example, minimum critical area of habitat, and so on. And it's I guess the question is, different species might have a different habitat range. And so, for example, if we wanted to have a Singapore sized area, not necessarily Singapore, to support big animals that roam a large over a wide range, such as a tiger, there's only so many that a Singapore area could support. However, yes, there would be this kind of trade-off. What kind of habitat and what kind of species would we like to have in terms of, let's say, maintaining the fundamental processes to have a sustainable, self-renewing forest, for example. And so I think, as an example, if you go to the Botanic Gardens, there's a 6-hectare original piece of rainforest, and it's beautiful, but I think 6 hectares in this case is maybe a little too small to have the whole suite of species that is needed to have this long-term sustainability. Whereas Bukit Timah at 1.5 square kilometers seems, at least so far, to be large enough. And I think so, Mike, to answer that question, I think the answer probably somewhere in between, on the order of, let's say you have a 30 hectare to 40 hectare park like Kent Ridge. That should be Kent Ridge Park. That should be large enough for a sustainable forest system. And the question is, can we afford to have areas of that size and also meet the other needs of a place like Singapore? I think we can, and we have very smart people who are working on it. But I think yeah, that's the fundamental challenge in a modern metropolis that wants to be a city in nature at the same time.
Yeah. That's
Uh,
yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Adrian,
I just no, as Sean was talking also, and then as he was presenting, I just have to jump in here and talk. I mean, I like the resilience of the fragments that he spoke about, and we are connecting these fragments, through nature ways and through our park connectors as well as planning corridors. So, I think one of the strategies is to in a way connect these fragments as well. Yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Yeah.
Mm. I wanted to point out a very interesting question by Trinian there. Is there a plan to import disappeared animals into Singapore forests after the 1 million tree movement plan, such as tigers and other? There is actually a school of thought out there that is quite strongly proposing this sort of thing, right? Reintroduction of animals that once lived here but have now gone extinct. And the answer to that is right now we already have our hands full in trying to conserve the rare and endangered species that we have. And I think that should be the first priority. The extinct animals were extinct for a reason, either because of hunting or because of a change in their habitats because of farming and so on and so forth. But there are a few species, there are quite a number of species which are still hanging on. And I think they deserve to be given a chance by us. And that's what we work on when we are talking about our species recovery programs for the flora and fauna in Singapore. Work on the ones that are still in Singapore, that are extremely rare, that need a helping hand, and we leave the extinct animals. And for now, the really cool thing is that when we get our ecosystems back to speed, right, and we enhance them and we restore them, you will see once extinct animals re-emerge in Singapore. So for Trinian, all the things that we actually find sometimes quite common now, like the hornbills, like the smooth-coated otters, they are actually animals that were once extinct in Singapore, but have made a comeback simply because we clean up our waterways. We have restored and enhanced our parklands and forests. And that's actually the better way to go there.
Although Dr. Jim, I mean,
I'm not a doctor.
And I don't want to cause trouble here, but consider wild boar. That's native, and they disappeared because of hunting. But here's a large animal that can make a big impact, and it reproduces very quickly. And the question is Singapore, without its large predators, really able to have wild boar in the system, doing what wild boars do, without them kind of overwhelming the limited forested area? So that's, I think, very ironic. It's interesting case study, native species, but potentially I fear that it could cause a lot of negative impact, just because it's that particular balance in the system might not be here that was here when we had leopards and tigers and so on.
Right. It's actually very interesting, and of course, it's a whole complex of issues that we have to deal with when we are talking about how Singapore becomes a city in nature, and really what the definition of nature is. Right, there probably will be limits to how much nature that we can actually introduce and entertain and cultivate in Singapore. And of course, it happens every day, right? This discussion, this dialogue that we have with people, with academics, and with the community. Yeah, but it really is very interesting. There are very strong proponents. Quite a number of people are actually in favor of having tigers reintroduced into Singapore, but obviously there will be issues associated with that. But again, Mother Nature is complex, ecology is complex, and we have to deal with it best we can in the context of Singapore wanting to be a city in nature. So thank you very much for that controversial little nugget. There are a few other questions here, but we are running out of time. So what I would actually like you all to do is, if you have any pressing questions that you want answered, please email them to our secretariat and we will answer them for you, right? So there are a few of questions that have yet been answered. Please email them to the secretariat. And we will get on track to ending this session so that everybody can relax and go for a nice dinner with family members at the end of Friday. All right, so thank you to everybody who has stayed on since it started. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Hong Yan. Thank you, Yang, and thank you, Shawn, so much for staying, so much for your presentations. And before we end the program, of course, a few things to let everybody know, all 230 of you who have stayed on. This is the first of a series of NParks webinars, which is associated with the M&D R&D e-Symposium series. The next NParks one will be happening on the 6th of August. We will be sending out the EDMs very soon to all of you. So if you're interested, please sign up for the next one. Now, moving on to the bigger one, right? The Urban Sustainability R&D e-series. It will have a few e-symposias, a few other webinars, which are not necessarily NParks. There's one coming up on sustainable energy transformation. There's another one on the built environment, innovation and enterprise. So these talks are all free. These webinars are all free. If you're interested, please sign up for them, right? So the other thing you can do if you're interested in what we all do together to basically make Singapore a livable city, please visit the Urban Sustainability R&D portal, and you can see the calendar of events for the webinars. You'll be able to share your ideas and read about research, innovation, and enterprise 2025 plans and contribute your suggestions. And you can learn about the R&D programs, test bidding opportunities, and I can see a few of the people here are actually from academia and from industry. If you are really interested, please go down. There's a QR code in the lower right-hand corner. Please scan the QR code. It will bring you to the portal, and there's so much to learn. So with that, I thank every single one of you for coming down. Have a nice weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.